Well, today we're going to look at a successful personal luxury coupe from the Lincoln Motor Car Company, and that is this 1971 Lincoln Continental Mark III. Now, the Mark III was introduced in the 1969 model year. 1971 would be the final year for the Mark III before the Mark IV would be introduced in 1972. And this particular Mark III is finished in a gorgeous color called Ivy Bronze Moondust. And the Moondust just means that it was a metallic paint. This was an optional paint that the buyer paid extra for. And in fact, this car has a number of options aside from that Ivy Bronze Moondust. It has cruise control and tilt wheel and leather seating areas, as we're going to see in a minute or so. But the window sticker on this particular car ran up to $9,600 in 1971. That's about $75,000 in 2025 dollars. So this was a very, very expensive car indeed, and was the top of the Lincoln lineup. And I have to say that, especially juxtaposed against this kind of desert setting that you see here, this color looks absolutely great. But let's talk a little bit more about some of the exterior styling and features about how this Mark III also came to be. And the genesis of the Mark III really came about when Lee Iacocca, who was then president of the Ford Motor Division, asked designers to essentially throw a Rolls-Royce grille on a Thunderbird. And that's what you have here. The Mark III clearly has a Rolls-Royce style grille. I mean, you can imagine that this was not something that designers really wanted to do, but they did so begrudgingly, and it ended up being a huge success. Lee Iacocca, for all of his faults, was somebody that during this time really couldn't do much wrong. He was behind the Mustang and this Mark III, among many other cars, and generated a significant amount of success for Ford Motor Company. But let's talk now a little bit more about the exterior styling as we look at this particular front three-quarter view. Now, the Mark III, as other vehicles from Ford during this time frame, really typified the Jean Bourdonnais era of styling at Ford Motor Company. And it's so different from General Motors or Chrysler. Remember, Chrysler during this time had the fuselage cars, and the fuselage-style Imperial would come out in 1969. And Ford just had a very different look. They have this kind of slab-sided, architectural, fill the cube, so to speak, look. And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, let's take a look at the fender tops here, which are perfectly flat. And you have a perfectly flat fender top going into the door, forming the belt line. And it's just something that Ford did on many vehicles during this time frame. For whatever reason, Jean Bourdonnais loathed belt lines that had some sort of a rise to them or did too much that was artistic. So much so that when Ford would come out with the Escort in the early 1980s, they did two separate Escorts, one for, let's say, the European version, one for the U.S. version. I should say some of those also sold around the world too. But there were two main versions, and the U.S. version had a flat belt line because Jean Bourdonnais mandated that there could not be a rising belt line on the U.S.-based Escort. So this was Ford styling. It was the flat fender look and the steady belt line. And also, if you look at the body side there's really not much surfacing to describe here. There are the wheel arches, which are interesting. They start pretty narrow. If you look at the leading edge of the wheel arch, it's very narrow, and then it kind of fattens out as it goes up the fender and then starts arcing downward where it terminates at the rocker. So that is an interesting element here. But aside from the wheel arches, there's really not much surfacing on the body side here to speak of. There is a crease that's a little small to kind of discern here that runs along the entire length of the car to break up some of that monotony, kind of like what you saw on the Mark IIs that had that beautiful little crease that went down the body side. But other than that, there's not much else here. Now let's for a moment contrast that style with a competitor from 1969, this Rampur Green Eldorado. And notice the body side here. You could certainly not say it's slab-sided or that it doesn't have various visual elements. Take a look at how the fender top just gracefully forms a surface there on the door as it goes rearward. And then on the quarter panel, you have a definitive character line that comes up near the C-pillar and then goes back toward the rear of the vehicle. And you have some pretty distinctive tuck-in on the body side underneath a crease that unfortunately on this car, body side molding covers up. but it's kind of barrel-shaped on the side. And, of course, you have wheel arches that here on the Cadillac are in this squircle style. I love how the bumper has this feature that continues rearward toward the front wheel and gradually fades out and tapers. Just a lot of visual drama here on the 1969 Eldorado. Let's return now to the Mark III. There's really none of that here, so to speak. Yes, the body does tuck in at the rocker, but that's about it in terms of the styling here on the Mark. Now, you do have this very prominent hood with the power dome, similar to what you would see on the Cadillac. Here, that power dome really extends forward into the grille and starts forming the grille shape and that Rolls-Royce vertical textured grille. The rest of the Mark, if we start to rotate around it, let's go to the rear three-quarter now, is rather similar in its simplicity. And I think there is a beauty in the simplicity of the Mark III. You can also, by the way, see in this particular view how squinty the greenhouse is on the car. Just not a lot of glass area. And when you're sitting in it, it almost feels like you're sitting in a modern-day sports car because there isn't much glass area. The Mark IV was even worse, I would say. But Ford, as opposed to General Motors and Chrysler, in some of these vehicles, just really made the glass area relatively small. And I think of the big three, they were more extreme on the proportions than GM or Chrysler. I do like the rear. Of course, you have the faux spare tire hump here on the trunk that continues on into the bumper, a nice detail. The tail lamps that are integrated into the quarter panel forms, you can really see that body side crease here. It does kind of kick up around the C-pillar and then flattens out again as it moves rearward on the car. But really, aside from that faux spare tire hump, this is an overall simplistic and architectural design, I would say, like I've previously mentioned. And now let's, for a moment, contrast that again with the 69 Eldorado. I don't think you could call this rear end simplistic. Take a look at that deck lid and how it compares to the Continental, which was pretty plain aside from the faux spare tire hump. Here you've got creases and ins and outs and this filleted surface on the back portion of the deck lid below the crease that gives it some dimension as well as a nice reflection. Just take a look at the reflections on this deck lid and compare those with the previous photo of the Mark III, and you'll see what I mean in terms of the overall surface complexity. So again, not good, not bad, just Ford was different. And I think the Mark III is a handsome car in many ways. Although I will say, if you take a look at this side photo here, the side looks a little awkward to my eye. And I can't quite place it. Something about that front fender and the wheel arch and the crease and how that wheel arch is very proximate to the crease. And there's not much overall visual height there, I guess. I can't quite, again, pinpoint. And the overhang looks a little bit too extreme in the front. You almost want to tidy that out, push the wheels further out to give the car a little bit more dash to axle proportion. And then maybe you want to push that rear wheel rearward too. Now this car, the Mark III, did have a relatively short wheelbase, around 116 inches at the time. And the car was 216 inches in overall length. So it was smaller than the full-size cars. And I guess I would want to just extend the wheelbase, I think, as the first piece. And then I would go to work on the midsection and maybe lengthen the passenger compartment a little bit. But again, hard to say. This view strikes me as looking a bit odd compared to the three-quarter views and the dead-on front and dead-on rear. But enough about the exterior styling. Let's talk a little bit about the interior here, because I think this is where the Mark III really shines. The fit and finish and interior materials of the Mark III were just excellent, beyond what was on that Eldorado, and I think the theme was also quite attractive too. Look at that door panel. That is real wood. 1969 Ford would use fake wood, not because of cost reasons, but because they thought that they couldn't get real wood to be as durable as they wanted it to be. But by 1970, they had figured it out, and 1971s also have the real wood on the doors as well as the instrument panel. And I think it looks just rich and classy. And the theme, while it is very boxy, you have these 5 pods. On the leftmost pod, you have the fuel and the oil pressure gauge. Then you have the speedometer. Then you have the Cartier clock by this point. Cartier didn't really design it. They just licensed their name. And then as you go to the right of the Cartier clock, you have more gauges for the engine temperature and volts. And then to the right of that is the wiper control and the washer control, as well as the rear ventilation. You can turn that on and off by a little rotating switch there, rotating knob, and that opens and closes a air door on the package shelf that lets air come out the back package shelf while the windows are up. Perfect for cigar smokers. Now, as we zoom in a little bit on the instrument panel, you can see the cruise control. There's an on toggle that is all the way up on the left there, hanging there. You pull and push it to activate the cruise, or at least just turn it on, and then you have to depress the button at the end of the turn signal lever to set the cruise. Then you have the three-spoke wheel, which here you could get cruise control with the three-spoke wheel because, as I mentioned, the on-off switch was located off the steering wheel. Other Ford vehicles, you'd have the two-spoke wheel with the cruise control buttons on it, but not on the Mark III. You'd have just this one three-spoke wheel that was color-coded to the interior. Cadillac, by the way, by this point, was just using black steering wheels and black instrument panel inserts, irrespective of which interior color you got. Cheap, but not on the Lincoln. Now, before we go into other elements of this car, this does have a lot of content on it, especially for the time. People think that modern cars have a lot of these conveniences, but they forget that a lot of these old cars had a lot of them too. This has automatic climate control, as you saw, power windows, vacuum-operated power locks, power seat. So there's a lot of different convenience features on this that, well, you get on modern-day cars, but of course they're executed on this vehicle mechanically and without a computer. There is no onboard computer, obviously, on this Mark III. Now, on another piece of unique content, this car doesn't have it, but another Ivy Bronze Moondust car does. This is the optional automatic headlamp dimmer, and that is the sensor that senses the oncoming headlights of a car and will automatically dim your bright lights for you. Kind of gimmicky. I guess back in the day when there was a lot more two-lane road traffic, it was probably more relevant, but they do work. I have one on my Mark III, and it does work quite well. Another little interesting bit of trivia is this C-pillar that you see here in the vinyl top. These do have a very unique style of vinyl top. This kind of corduroy style vinyl is used, and that's correct for the car. The Mark IV would also have that. But the vinyl top is only padded on the side underneath or below the seam that you see there. It's not padded in the midsection of the roof. I don't know why. That's one way that you can tell if the vinyl tops are original, if they've been redone. They only have the padding that is beneath or lower than that seam that you see. Now, as we rotate under hood, we see the last year for the premium fuel 460 cubic inch, 365 horsepower Ford V8. This was a Lincoln exclusive at the time. It would be a Lincoln exclusive until partway through the model year 1972, when the 460 would be offered on some other Ford vehicles. But by that point, it was a regular fuel 460, and didn't quite pack the wallop that this premium fuel 460 does. These are great engines, very smooth, and they're super powerful. I mean, my 69 Mark III has this engine, and it will scoot away from a stoplight very, very quickly. No issues in terms of acceleration or holding this car at 85, 90 miles per hour. It's just a very pleasant engine overall. Now, by 1971, they had added on a few little doodads. They have this air cleaner snorkel that goes into the passenger side fender for cold air, as well as noise suppression. Still has the two-piston York Tecumseh compressor that you can see for the air conditioning. 1 year later on the Mark IVs, they would go to the GM-style Harrison air conditioning compressor. And you can see the distributor in the middle there, characteristic of many Ford V8s, that distributor up in the front. Only downside is that sometimes they get stuck and seized and get hard to turn. So, yeah, let's just say every year or 6 months, make sure you squirt a ton of PB Blaster on that distributor, on the base of the distributor, just to try to keep it lubricated so that it doesn't seize up on you, and move it around, reset the timing. I've had these get pretty stuck in there, and then they get hard to rotate. But, well, that's one tip to help you and to make sure that your distributor doesn't get seized. And there you have it, the 1971 Mark III. Now, if I were buying a luxury car in 1971, what would I have picked? This or the 71 Eldorado, which had been refreshed for 1971 and was all new? I think I actually would have picked the Mark III. The interior quality And the overall fit and finish of these cars is just beyond reproach. And I couldn't say the same for the Eldorado. I like the styling of the Eldorado, but the interior materials and the fit and finish just was not up to snuff for a luxury car, which is unfortunate because otherwise I think those look great. But the Mark III was a very high quality car, much higher quality than the Mark IV. I think the Mark IV was a discernible step down from the Mark III. And if you can pick up a 69 to 71 Mark III, they're still relatively cheap in terms of collector cars. I don't know why. They're fabulous cars. They're kind of hard to repair. A lot of vacuum lines from the door locks to the hidden headlamps, which have vacuum actuators in them, to the cruise control and the climate control. Maybe that's why. But the basic running gear is bulletproof. The C6 transmission, 460 engine, the Ford rear ends that are extremely stout. So I would definitely recommend picking one up if you can. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care.